Hello and welcome to AFAL Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on afalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello, welcome to Stories from Turkey. I'm Hala Akay, and today we will talk about censorship on literature in Turkey over obscenity. Our guest is Elizabeth Nolte, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Warwick, who has worked on the history of censorship in Turkey. Welcome, Elizabeth. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, in fact, a sudden outrage that erupted in Turkish social media 2 weeks ago is the reason why we are doing this podcast today.
Yes.
But before discussing what is happening nowadays, I first want to start with what had happened before.
Mm-hmm.
So if we go back to 1923, to the foundation of the Turkish Republic, and start from there, how did the young republic, which had a very strict secular stance in a Muslim-majority country, start to deal with literature and obscenity?
Sure. So I'll give you a bit of a historical overview, and then I can talk about one particularly notorious case of a trial for obscenity. So if we go back to the first years of the Turkish Republic, in 1924, the League of Nations enacted the International Convention for the Suppression of the Circulation of and Traffic in Obscene Publications, and Turkey was a signatory to this treaty. So the types of obscene publications that were identified in this treaty were primarily visual and image-based. So for example, paintings, pictures, posters, photographs, etc., although obscene writing was also included on the list. So to generalize, we can say that in the 1920s, international efforts to regulate obscene publications focused on sexually explicit images and nude photographs rather than literature. In 1926, the Turkish Criminal Code criminalized the authorship, publication, and distribution of obscene material, with fines upwards of 500 lira and up to 2 years in prison. And then a year later, in 1927, the Council for the Protection of Minors from Harmful Publications was founded. However, during the early years of the Turkish Republic, there is little to no censorship of literature on the grounds of obscenity, even though popular erotic literature was in pretty wide circulation. And this literature mainly consisted of collections of short stories and Ottoman on topics such as seduction, adultery, love, deception, and such. And one of the first examples that we have is a collection of stories under the title Bin Bir Buse, or 1001 Kisses. And it was published in 1923 and 1924 in 2 different series by an unknown publisher and unknown authors, although there are lots of theories as to who was behind this. And many of the stories in 1001 Kisses are translations, mainly from French publications. So this is significant because historically, obscenity cases in Turkey involve works of translation into Turkish and cases brought against the translator and publisher, rather than literature that's originally written in Turkish by Turkish authors. And that's another reason that the current public outcry over Turkish works is very unusual, given the history of obscenity cases in Turkey. So while there were collections like 1001 Kisses that were not known to have been censored during this time period, they actually were the subject of debate by intellectuals, and this was mainly in relation to the nation-building effort. So a lot of the debate in literary and legal circles focused on specific questions, such as how do we define obscenity, how do we determine literary value, and importantly, what is the potential for harm to young minds? A lot of obscenity cases early on are associated with potential harm to youth and young people having access to these materials. In the course of these debates, this is when we first see the idea to consult an expert to evaluate a work's literary merit, and that became commonplace in obscenity trials after this period. So in 1931, there was a restrictive press law that was implemented to regulate printed material, although the main aim of the law was to suppress political opposition. And even though this law regulated the press, it affected the literary scene, because during this time, serialization in newspapers and magazines was the primary form of publication for literary works, rather than book form publication. And the law included a definition in Article 31 of what qualified as obscene publications, and that was that which was regarded as shameful. But it included an exemption for works of art and science, and this exemption has remained largely in effect in the subsequent penal codes. So the 1931 press law represents the first major crackdown on allegedly obscene publications. After it was implemented, several newspapers were temporarily closed and roughly 70 cases of press offenses prosecuted, and most of these offenses were on obscenity grounds. And then in 1939, the first publishing congress was held, and it initiated a translation project. The Translation Bureau at this time was housed under the Ministry of Education, and they were given the mission to translate works of world literature to facilitate the modernization and westernization efforts of the early Turkish Republic. So literature and translations in particular were seen as having a transformative role and a tool to implement the reforms that were in place in the early Turkish Republic. So it's in this context in 1939 that we have one of the most notorious cases of an obscenity trial in Turkish history. And this involved the Turkish translation of Pierre Louis' novel Aphrodite, Ancient Manners. And this was originally published in 1836. The Turkish translation was under the title Aphrodite Eski Adetler, and this is 1939, and it was translated into Turkish by Nasuhi Baydar, and it was published by Semi Lutfi Kitabevi as part of the translation series of the masterpieces of world literature. So this is significant because the publisher was publishing this specifically as a masterpiece of world literature and such. So in 1939, in September, the publisher and Kenan Dinçman, who was the owner of the printing house, Kenan Basanevi, were both charged for obscene additions to the novel that allegedly were not in the original source text. What's unusual in this case is that the translator was not charged, but that was likely because he was a member of parliament and received immunity. So as was the process with these cases, the literary work in question would be sent to an expert. This was typically a prominent author or professor who would determine for the court whether the text was obscene or held literary merit. In the case of Aphrodite, the first expert determined that the novel was indeed obscene. And this determination was widely condemned by authors, literary critics, and intellectuals from across the political spectrum, even those who had previously had a history of criticizing erotic literature. And here we see a stark contrast with the current case of Zumrüt Apartment, where there's political pressure from the left and the right for the investigation. In the case of Aphrodite, public consensus and the majority of intellectuals defended the translation's literary merit and argued that Aphrodite belonged to the canon of world literature. So the lengthy trial received widespread media coverage and public debate. It was on the front page of all the papers, and it was even said to have overshadowed the news of the outbreak of World War II. A second panel of 3 academics was appointed, and they determined that the novel was not obscene, but a piece of literature. However, the prosecutor was determined, and he refused to drop the case, and he persisted with the charges of obscenity. And in fact, he actually accused the press of essentially manipulating public opinion and trying to influence the expert witnesses. At this point, it had become such a high-profile case that the courtroom was consistently packed with young supporters, and the police would have to be called in to disperse the crowds. So finally, the defendants were acquitted after a third expert report by the Turkish Education Board determined that the book was not obscene. But then cases were brought against several prominent columnists, including Sabiha Sertel and Necip Fazıl, for trying to interfere in the legal process through the articles that they had written in the mainstream media. So one of the reasons that the case of Aphrodite created such a stir is that it was seen in the context of the Translation Bureau's mission and the nation building project as something of a national embarrassment that a novel that was considered to be a piece of world literature was being censored in Turkey. And another long-lasting effect of this trial was concern by public prosecutors and state institutions about media reporting and public interest, that this had gained so much attention and turned into such a scandal that it actually had the unintended consequence of making the book a bestseller. And in fact, after the case, there were multiple retranslations, lots of counterfeit translations that were flooding the market. So this led to calls to conduct obscenity trials in private, specifically to not attract public attention and create such a scandal. So that's the context in terms of the early Turkish Republic and the laws that were being put into place and some of the first test cases.
I really wonder if anybody remembers that book now in Turkey.
Right.
So when we reach to the end of 1940s, Turkey passes from a single-party government to a multi-party one.
Right.
And in Turkey, that meant also more representation for relatively more conservative and religious masses. Did this create any change in attitude toward obscenity and toward literature, of course?
Right. So one of the big transformations with the end of the single-party period and the introduction of multi-party politics was sort of the transformation of the literary market and the role of authorship. So throughout Turkish history, periods of severe censorship and suppression of free speech rights strongly correlate with political repression and restrictions on the media. And during the single-party era, this connection was explicit because the primary form of publication of literary works was serialization in newspapers. And authors also often served as members of parliament and had pressure to toe the party line. So with the transition to the multi-party system, book form publication started to replace serialization. So we start seeing censorship take the form of book banning, prosecution, fines, and taxes, all as the primary means. While before, when newspapers were the primary means of publication, it would be the newspaper would be shut down temporarily, or an author would have his work removed from the paper and such. So with the inauguration of competitive politics, which started in January 1946 with the registration of the opposition Democratic Party, and then was followed by the party's sweeping 1950 election victory, this had huge ramifications for Turkey's literary scene and censorship. The introduction of the opposition party to the literary scene of the 1950s created what the literary historian Çimen Günay describes as a, quote, dualistic political structure in which literature became a more evident locus and the monopoly of power in the domains of which both camps fought for domination and control, end quote. And authors' loyalty was tested. So one notorious example of this involved the author Mahmut Makal, who was a graduate of the Koy Institutleri, or the Village Institutes. And his stories of life in the village, where he was a teacher, were first published in 1948 in the literary journal Varlık, or Being. And after the publication of the collected essays under the title Bizim Koy, or Our Village, he was arrested on suspicion of subversion, only to be immediately released, at which point his novella was appropriated by the Democratic Party in the run-up to the 1950 election as a campaign document that revealed the failure of the Republican People's Party's policies. So gradually throughout the 1950s, the Democratic Party under Prime Minister Adnan Menderes consolidated its power over the literary market through restrictions on the press, publications, and the universities. So while before the question was really whether a work was literary or lewd, now obscenity became politicized and a political issue. So increasingly during this period, we see obscenity become associated with external political or cultural threats, such as communism, later the sexual revolution, even though there's no relation. So in contrast to earlier years when authors and critics from across the political spectrum would rally to defend a work's literary merit and say that it was a work of world literature and defend it against obscenity charges, in this new era of political polarization, ideological divisions developed with conservative voices, conservatives voicing concerns over the collapse of moral and political values. And here we see translations again becoming an issue. So previously they had served the cultural policy of the single party era, but now translations represented a foreign threat and were seen as the importing of obscene values that did not adhere to Turkish standards. One consequence of this politicization of obscenity is translations is that the Translation Bureau lost its former influence, and it was actually discontinued in 1967. So the authoritarian and anti-bureaucratic measures of the Menderes era precipitated Turkey's first military takeover in May 1960, and the intervention was generally celebrated by university communities and the literary field. The reinstatement of parliamentary democracy in 1961, accompanied by the introduction of a more liberal constitution that permitted a broad range of political activity, inaugurated an era of freedom and spurred debate over diverse political and social issues. In fact, changes including the institution of political reforms, the easing of press and censorship laws, and the proliferation of political parties actually galvanized the literary scene in the early 1960s. And authors were among the most prominent political actors during this time. And another shift that we see is while earlier literary journals and newspapers remained subject to the censorship of the political parties, especially this pressure to temper criticism of the ruling party, they were not actually founded with the aim of endorsing a political philosophy or party, but that became the case in the 1960s. So generally, things became much more politicized. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in contrast, the periodicals and papers that emerged after the military intervention opened numerous avenues for publication to authors, but they tended to command adherence to political ideology and exchange. Mm-hmm. And in the context of the late 1960s, these stakes assumed an increasingly dangerous character as tensions between rightist and leftist groups, exacerbated by the anti-leftist campaign of the ruling Adalet Partisi, or Justice Party, under Süleyman Demirel, eventually erupted into violence. And the repercussions for the literary market were twofold. The atmosphere of political freedom gave way to state censorship and close scrutiny of publications and authors. In reaction to the external threat of violence came under internal pressure to close ranks and strictly adhere to their ideological affiliation. So while state censorship had carried explicit consequences such as imprisonment or the suppression of publication, it had also, mobilized the literary markets to ensure that literature would be published and distributed. So in contrast, during this time period, we see a lot more self-censorship and intensifying political polarization, which had significant implicit consequences for the literary scene, particularly in terms of the literary work itself, when we're talking about self-censorship. Mm-hmm. And by the end of the 1960s, the literary market had been permanently impacted by the political changes of the previous decades. So specifically this transition to the multi-party system and the 1960 military coup, authorship had transformed into a political act. and the reception of literature by both the state and literary circles was governed by its political potential. So that's also why we see this transformation in obscenity, the question of obscenity in literature, that it becomes much more of a political question. And by the mid-1970s, there was a renewed campaign against obscenity. And this was led by Shavkat Kazan, who was a member of the National Salvation Party. And he was also the Minister of Justice in 1974. And he was just determined to attack, all obscene forms of literature. And he, in fact, founded a commission to fight obscene publications and sought to further criminalize the publication and distribution of literature that was deemed obscene. So obscenity again became a big topic of public debate, and censorship for obscenity was not limited to literature. It's during this time period that we also see it being applied to other forms of art. This included everything from vinyl records to public statues. For example, the Güzel İstanbul heykeli, the statue of beautiful Istanbul that was erected in Karaköy, and it was a statue of a nude woman, and also theater productions that were shut down in this time period.
So if you move forward, I think, and that's only my humble opinion, but the 1980 coup and the period afterwards, the juncture for this issue, as during that time we started to observe the rise of Islamism in Turkey.
Right.
And at the end of 1980s, harsh restrictions were imposed on the media over obscenity. For example, magazines like Playboy and Penthouse were forced to be sold in plastic bags.
Right.
And what happened in the literature?
Right. So the period following the 1980 military coup was characterized by contradictions in the literary scene. So this period we see human rights abuses and very restrictive, severe censorship. But it was also a time of cultural opening and historical reckoning. And the post-1980s, I would argue, in many ways set the precedent for the contemporary cultural scene, both with this antagonistic coexistence of what the literary critic Nurdan Gurbilek terms, quote, the repression of speech and the explosion of speech, end quote, but also specifically in the state's development of a strategy to try to appropriate culture and restrict freedom of expression through legislation and corporatization. So for example, in the post-80s response to the escalating war on the Kurds in southeastern Turkey, the state expanded the legislation of terrorism offenses to include the propagation of the goals of terrorist groups. So this ambiguous definition of terror was broadly applied as a form of censorship to stifle legitimate activities and also to suppress cultural production that did not conform to the official historical narrative. Literature was specifically targeted, and chief prosecutors were authorized to suspend publications. And that was an action that had previously required a court order. So in addition to the introduction of legislative tactics that are widely in practice today, the post-80s period also witnessed the corporatization as a state strategy to appropriate culture. So in the 1980s, the market was freed and Turkey rapidly became a consumer society. But with that, it meant that capital and the market started playing more of a determining role in culture. So for example, a lot of corporations relied on state backing for profit. And the state started to use this favor and leverage it as a new form of censorship to exercise authority over corporations and specifically over the content that they produced. An example of this too, I had mentioned before the Council for the Protection of Minors from Harmful Publications, which was founded back in 1927. And it's during the 1980s that the powers of this council were vastly expanded in the wake of the military rule and then Turgut Özal's administration. So in 1986, code number 1117, which related to the actual formation of the council, this code was amended specifically to grant more power to the council. And as the council gained more power, the expertise and the impartiality of its members became a subject of heated debate in the public. We see this in developments surrounding the case of Henry Miller translation. So in 1985, Can Yayınları published the Turkish translation of Henry Miller's novel Tropic of Capricorn. And then in February of 1986, legal proceedings were brought against the publisher and the translator. In 1988, the translation was banned and all copies seized and destroyed. And the appeal was rejected based on Article 426 of the Turkish Penal Code. And this article included an exemption for works deemed to have artistic or intellectual merit, which is this exemption that had been long in place in the different variations of the Turkish Penal Code since the early Republic. But the court ruled that the Tropic of Capricorn had no literary value and was, in fact, obscene and offensive, that it endangered moral values and incited sexual desire in the public. So the experts who made this determination were appointed from the members of the Council for the Protection of Minors from Harmful Publications. And this was seen as a bit of a shift, too, because it was the legal field and sort of non-literary experts who were making determinations about whether literature was obscene or not. And in protest, 39 publishers republished the translation, and they tried to get around the book ban by moving the censored sections into a prefix to the book, which also included the court proceedings and the council report. So theoretically, a reader would be able to read the book in its entirety by referring to the censored sections and the context of the report. But the book was banned again, and a case brought against the publishers. And the court eventually found the publishers not guilty, and they were acquitted. And then finally, 2 years later, in 1991, Can Yayınları republished the translation together with the court decision and the censored sections redacted.
Mm-hmm. I have this edition at home in Istanbul, yeah. So again, if we try to move a bit more forward, what can we say about the last 17 years when Turkey has been ruled by an Islamist government? Did that change things?
Yes, I'd say in recent years, particularly after the 2013 Gezi Park protests and the 2016 attempted coup, the Turkish state has resurrected the censorship tactics of the 1980s and seeks to legislate and corporatize culture and to suppress freedom of expression. So Turkey has ranked among the top in the world in incarcerating journalists, and there's been severe censorship of traditional media in recent years. But the state has actually started applying the same strategies used against the media, and these strategies include monetary punishments, incarceration, the expansion of the definition of terrorist offenses, and the consolidation of the industry into official and pro-government entities. They're applying these to the publishing and bookselling industry. One significant change has been in the book banning process. So the publishing sectors that have been subject to the greatest scrutiny from the authorities are mainly three areas. So this would be nonfiction, in particular investigative journalism, obscene literature, as an erotic or adult literature that's deemed obscene, and then finally, children's and young adult literature, which has been subject to a lot of censorship recently. And the publishing industry has been profoundly affected by the unpredictable nature of the state's policy and legislative changes that were pushed through under the 2016 state of emergency decrees. So one significant transformation is the accelerated process for book banning. So modifications to the judicial procedure have expedited the process, essentially by eliminating the prosecution and conviction stage and by instructing the court to notify only the bookseller via email or post that a book is banned. So this effectively sidesteps the publisher altogether, which means that publishers have to assume more financial risk if they decide to publish a book because they don't know whether or not it will be banned, and they often learn from the bookseller calling them saying, your book has been banned. And this also extends to state withdrawal of financial support from the publishing industry for activities such as attending international book fairs, as well as to the consolidation of culture within official institutions, such as the ministries of culture and education. Another example of the state's tactics involve book retail chains. So these have been predominantly owned by media corporations with known ties to the state and the AKP. And the largest store, DNR, was customarily perceived to be an outlier. And then the state initially levied tax fines against DNR's corporate holder, Dewan Media Group, in 2009 of 6.8 billion Turkish lira, and what was commonly interpreted as retaliation for coverage of the AKP government and allegations, critical coverage, and allegations of corruption. And then in March 2018, Dewan Media Group was sold to the pro-government conglomerate Demirel Holding, and in April 2018, DNR was then sold to Turkovaz Media Group, which has close familial and political ties to Erdogan and the ruling AKP. Mm-hmm. So the state's renewed its efforts to appropriate culture by applying the same tactics used against the media to consolidate cultural production to official and pro-government entities. And these actions also include retroactive enforcement. So this is where I do see a big shift in censorship from the 1980s to the present moment. That it's a shift from centralized censorship and control of mass media and culture, the 1980s, to a much more arbitrary system that's decentralized and unpredictable and ambiguous of today. And one of the reasons that this is very troubling is it's easier for publishers and authors to work when they have red lines that they know that they can't cross in a way, and when there's retroactive censorship and it's ambiguously applied and arbitrarily applied, it puts everyone in a much more precarious situation in many ways, and actually leads to much more self-censorship. And from my sources, my understanding is that self-censorship is widely in practice today, both at the authorial level and the editorial level. Mm-hmm. In terms of recent obscenity trials, there's the 2012 cases of Cell Publishing and the translator Namek Suha Sertabolu for the translation of William Burroughs' The Soft Machine, and then Aronce Publishing House for Chuck Palahniuk's satire Snuff. And these also mark a shift in obscenity trials. In this case, rather than relying on an expert opinion as to the literary value of the works, the judge postponed the trial for 3 years. So he was dragging the trial out, and he actually warned the publishers that any future obscene publications that they published would be added to the present charge. And these cases didn't receive much media coverage, but the judge's decision was interpreted by the industry as a change in policy and actually an attempt to intimidate the publishers. So again, this is where we start seeing self-censorship at the authorial and editorial levels becoming much more common practice.
Mm-hmm. Nowadays, we have a very different situation.
Yes.
2 weeks ago, a screenshot of one page from a short story book published in 2013 suddenly created an outcry on social media. This one page from the book Zümrüt Apartment was about a man forcing a baby with no teeth, to oral sex. People demanded authorities to ban the book, and now both the author and the publisher face prison sentences. But it didn't end. It continued, and people started targeting other books, all interestingly this time written by women authors.
Mm-hmm.
For example, internationally renowned author Elif Shafak said authorities had launched an investigation into her novels.
Mm-hmm.
What can you say about this incident? What does it tell us about censorship in the age of social media?
Yeah, so the current investigation of Abdullah Shevki and his publisher is very different from all previous cases in Turkish history, and different for several reasons. First of all, this was initiated by the public, and I can't think of another case in which this has occurred where it's the public outcry and that's putting pressure on the authorities to censor these texts and take the author and publisher to court. Again, this is involving, and all of the other works in question are largely works by Turkish authors and not translations. And historically, in obscenity trials, as I've been discussing, most of the cases involve works of translation. And another difference is that this case involves a specific allegation of promoting child sex abuse. Usually in obscenity trials, the concern is, is this literature or is it lewd? What will this do to the minds of young readers? So, a lot of times it's been about protecting the youth potentially from material. But in this case, it's specifically about promoting child sexual abuse. So I think that this is reflective of the public outrage over recent high-profile child sex abuse cases. But I also think it is indicative of a broader movement towards citizen censorship and the policing of cultural content. We can also see this recently with children's literature. I said that children's literature was one of the three that's most censored in Turkey presently. And parents have actually been encouraged to report inappropriate content to the authorities in works of children's literature. And we also see this in the educational system where there's been a shift towards greater parental control and schooling. So I think this is part of a larger movement towards citizen censorship and taking control of cultural content. And unfortunately, as the accusations on social media mount against other authors for promoting child sex abuse through their writing, I think this could signal a period of extreme self-censorship. Another big difference in this case is, this piece of literature has been out since 2013. So, and many of the other pieces of literature that are being targeted have been on the market for years. So again, we're seeing this movement towards retroactive censorship and limiting access to content. I think, there are, in one way, this could be seen as public frustration with the authorities' inability to stem child sex abuse cases, and the public taking action to try to change things. But it could also be seen as the public trying to take action specifically because there are so many other restrictions on cultural content and media. And this is one way where the public can make a mark and affect change. But I think that this current case sets a very dangerous precedent, and it is very different from any other case in the history of Turkish trials for obscenity.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. This was such an informative conversation.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody who listened us in this podcast, and hope you all have a nice day. Thank you again.